Welcome back to Inside City Hall. Just before the break, we told you about an update in the city's investigation into secular education at some city yeshivas. Here now to talk more about this very emotional issue is a special panel from a coalition known as PEARLS. That's Parents for Education and Religious Liberty in Schools. They advocate on behalf of yeshivas. Avi Schick is the attorney for PEARLS. Avi Greenstein is a former yeshiva principal. And Rabbi David Zwiebel is on the executive committee of PEARLS and is the executive vice president of Agudat Israel of America. It's a nationwide advocacy organization. Thank you all for being here. Good to see you. And before we get into it, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what is being looked at and why. Do we all agree that it would be tragic if people were going through education all the way up to 12th grade and not learning the basics of math, science, history, and English?
Sure. Our yeshiva education is a wonderful education. There's a reason why parents are sacrificing so much to send their children to precisely these institutions, because it's this education that they want for their children. I'm a graduate of the yeshiva system. I've spent the better part of the last decade working in classrooms, both as a teacher and a principal. I've also worked with teachers and principals to help develop curriculum. I was very much involved in helping develop the PEARLS curriculum, which we can talk about. There's a misconception, perhaps painted by our critics, that the yeshivas provide some sort of a substandard education. That's not the case. We're very proud of our education. This is who we are, and we're very,
there's a very specific factual allegation, right? I mean, where they're saying in these, this subset of 29 or 30 schools, after 8th grade, people are getting 90 minutes of education, and in that 90 minutes, they're cramming in science, math, English, history, and phys ed, right? I mean, it's a very specific kind of an allegation.
I'm glad you brought it to the specific, Errol, because I think it's important to focus on, the city put out a letter yesterday, and I think it's important to focus what's in that letter as it relates to the specific allegations. The reality is that there were specific allegations, as you said, with respect to 29 schools. Of those, 24, 2 dozen, are elementary schools, K-8 schools. The city has been to the large majority of those schools, and if you read Chancellor Carranza's letter, it's quite clear that what the city saw in those schools, what it saw in the classrooms, what it learned from speaking with the teachers and principals, is entirely contrary to what Yafed alleged. Yafed's letter was short, and it said, in no uncertain terms, they don't have any instruction in the English language. It said they don't have any educational materials in the English language. That has been proven to be a false allegation.
But wait a minute, that's not what the letter says. The letter says they visited about half of the schools that they wanted to get into. There were 6 high schools that wouldn't even let them in the door. And they're saying that what they saw was in some cases, there were a couple of classes here and a couple of classes there. They made no findings about the quality of that education or whether it was anywhere near the state standard.
Again, I'm not sure that you and I are looking at the same document, Errol, but they absolutely, first of all, they were quite pleased with the education they saw. If one reads the Chancellor's letter, I think the Chancellor makes clear that they're happy with the spirit of cooperation, with the spirit of progress, with what they've seen. With respect to the handful of schools that they haven't visited yet, the schools they have visited, by the way, there are 15 schools which have the overwhelming portion of the student enrollment of the schools listed by Yafed. So they've seen 82%, if you look at the enrollment, 82% is covered, the vast majority. With respect to schools that have not yet been visited, they'll be visited in the coming school year. And the idea that to sort of gin up a controversy, instead of focusing on what the city did see in the schools that educate 13,000 students. There are 13,000 students in the schools the city saw. And I'd like to, let others speak about it as well. But surely a fair reading of the Chancellor's letter is that they were pleased with what they saw. Yeah?
One of the things that I was particularly pleased to see in the Chancellor's letter is that they came into the yeshivas and recognized that there's a dual program of instruction. There's many hours of the day are given over to something called religious studies, and a number of hours of the day are given over to what's called secular studies. What they did was said, we looked at the religious studies component of the day and discovered that, in fact, there's a lot of academic rigor to that type of instruction. And studying the Talmud and studying the Mishnah and studying the Bible, It's not simply a religious exercise. It has an unparalleled religious value to Orthodox Jews, or to religious Jews more generally, but besides that, it has extraordinary academic value, and this was specifically recognized in the Chancellor's letter, which I think is a very critical aspect of the entire evaluation.
I got to tell you guys, I really read this very differently. They were stalled, the investigators were stalled for 3 years. After 3 years, half the schools wouldn't let them in the front door, including all of the high schools. And there was absolutely no finding about the adequacy of the few schools that they were able to visit. Okay. I mean, that's you know, I mean, let's not call it something that it's not. And the point of the letter, in fact, was to ask the state education department how to proceed, because I don't know if they've ever encountered anything like this.
Errol, if I can just address, I happen to represent not only Pearls, but individually each of the schools that was named in the Fed complaint letter. Mm-hmm. I'm the lawyer for all of them. I'm the point of contact between the schools and the city. And I can tell you unequivocally mm-hmm. that I had no different instruction from one school versus another school in terms of cooperation, in terms of scheduling meetings, in terms of letting the city in. It's just not true that the city was barred or access was denied. It's just flatly not true. So
you're the contact then that I should ask whether you would let me and Lindsay Christ and a camera crew go in and visit one or several of the high schools?
Listen, I'm glad to have the conversation with the schools, as I think you know, as someone who's in the media and as a parent. Every school has its own policy about media. Every school has its own policy about whether you have to get releases from the parents. You can't just bring a camera crew in to a private school or a public school, candidly, without releases from parents. So I'm glad to have that conversation, Errol, but I can tell you this.
Well, after next year, anybody who was in high schools at the beginning of this entire process will have gone all the way through with absolutely no scrutiny from the outside world.
Errol, I can tell you this. When the city first gathered the schools in response to the complaint letter, which was the end of August 2015. Mm-hmm. The schools they gathered, which were chosen by them, not by us, were all elementary schools. The conversations we had with the city for 2016 and through 2017 were all elementary schools, Errol. It wasn't until sometime in September 2017 that the city felt comfortable releasing the list of schools in the Fed letter to us, and that's because they told us the Fed letter, complaint letter says, we ask you not to make this list public. Mm-hmm. It is true that there are 5 high schools on this list of what they said was 39 schools, but are really 29 schools. Mm-hmm. But Fed made a decision to keep it public. In fact, those who signed this letter, their name is still public, still private, although interestingly, the DOE letter, if you read it, the letter starts, the Fed complaint letter starts that we have parents of current students, and former teachers at all these yeshivas. Mm-hmm. In fact, the city had several sessions, right, if you read the letter, interviewing them, and they had no experience with the vast majority of the schools. All the signatories of the letter, while they said they have experience with all of them, first-hand experience, 11.
My understanding is there's sort of, I want to talk a little bit about these materials you brought in, but there's sort of a collateral question of the consequences for people if they complain too loudly. I mean, I've seen enough of the political backlash against these parents who said, look, you know, we went through these schools and they're not teaching our kids properly and they're suffering economically. They can't get a job, they can't calculate, they don't know their history. It's really quite poignant to see a grown man stand up and say, like, look, I had to Google how to Google, right? I didn't know anything after I came through these schools. So the idea of having a neutral investigation, you know, and not put the entire burden on the parents and the alums, the idea is that they should go in and they should find out. Here again, we wait 3 years. They're saying half the schools wouldn't let us in. We haven't seen any of the high schools. We have no prospect of going in anytime soon, and we don't know what to do. Along the way, though, you guys have tried to create some curriculum materials.
Just for a second, though, Errol, on one of the things you said, I think, which is very important, which is that parents feel that they have no choice. I mean, parents can and do choose with their feet. They, you know, if they're not happy with the education that their children are receiving in one of these yeshivas, they can move the child out of the yeshiva. There are so many options, even if they want to stay within the Jewish educational network and find a different kind of Jewish educational school with a heavier emphasis on secular studies as opposed to the one that they're in. They can walk. they can go out with their feet and choose and vote by. That's the delightful thing about school
Rabbi,
choice.
I think one of the goals of the state standards is to have a floor below which people can't
Agreed.
choose
And
to have an inferior education.
I think we have said very clearly that we believe that every child who goes to school, whatever kind of school it may be, when he emerges from the school experience, should be equipped to function as a productive member of society, which means they have to have certain basic educational skills, a sound basic education, and this is critical for all children. We're not denying that, and nobody's denying that.
Okay, we are out of time. I see you guys have made some materials, and the letter talks about you sort of working in the lower grades to sort of develop curriculum that's closer to the Common Core standards and some of the other basic standards. We're going to have to take that up another time. Thank you all so much for coming in. Everybody stay cool out there in this heat. We're going to take a short break here. Coming up, the de Blasio administration unveiled its plans for the 4 borough-based jails that are supposed to replace Rikers Island. We're going to bring you more details about the plan and get you some community reaction as well. Stay with us.